Hello, welcome back to Corey Hughes' Bloody History. I have to apologize. The past couple weeks I've been pretty sick and I haven't been able to really do a damn thing. But today I'm back and we are going to be covering some pretty amazing stuff today. Today, thanks to my boy Tony, who did the actual FOIA request for this, we are going to go over the exclusive documents pertaining to Elizabeth Forsling Harris and her 1978 deposition for the House. So I came across the name Elizabeth Forsling Harris as I was doing my research into Jack Valenti. And ultimately, Jack Valenti was the shooter on the knoll, and the only person to come forward and attempt to give Jack Valenti an alibi was Elizabeth Forsling Harris. So as I dig into Elizabeth Forsling Harris, I realize that she works for the CIA. She was with the Peace Corps. She was directly working for Bill Moyers at the time of the assassination. Or let me rephrase that. She was the contact between Sam Bloom and the Sam Bloom advertising agency who controlled the motorcade and everything going on with Kennedy's trip, and Bill Moyers. She was the go-between between the two of them. And then afterwards, she went on to go work for Ms. Magazine with Gloria Steinem. And thanks to Johnny Vedmore, we can pretty much close the book on her as having been a CIA agent, as Ms. Magazine was most certainly a CIA project. But this deposition we're going to go over today is exclusive. No one's ever seen it before. Tony and me are the first two people to ever lay our eyes on this thing. And so we're going to go ahead and we're going to cover this today. And the reason that she is so important is because she was the key person between the White House and Sam Bloom, who was on the ground in Dallas, who was the owner of the Sam Bloom advertising agency. So, this is pretty long. It's about 70 pages. I don't know if we'll get through all of it today, but I'm going to do my best. Okay, Select Committee on Assassinations reference the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, deposition of Elizabeth Forsling Harris, taken at 40 Central Park South, 20th floor, New York City, at 5:10 p.m. on August 16, 1978. Excuse me. My throat's still a little sore. Okay, she's sworn in, blah, blah, blah. Okay, we are here convened pursuant to House Resolution 222. I am designated counsel for the Select Committee on Assassinations to obtain a statement from Ms. Betty Harris. Ms. Harris, Elizabeth Forsling Harris is my full name. We are on the, I don't know where we are, 40 Central Park South on the 20th floor. Only persons present besides myself are Ms. Harris and the stenographer. And the person speaking is Mr. Matthews, who's doing the questioning. Ms. Harris, I have to inform you that I am authorized to take this statement and that you have been sworn by an authority who is authorized to administer oaths. You have agreed to give this deposition voluntarily. There has been no subpoena issued. Correct. And you understand you'll be given a copy of the transcript. Correct. Would you like a copy? Yes, I would. All right, let me skip over all this preamble garbage. Mr. Matthews says, Ms. Harris, do you understand that the context of the deposition that will be given here today is not to be considered as testimony from the committee, but it may be used by the committee or its staff as a basis for questioning witnesses before the committee, and it may be incorporated as part of the record only when you are unavailable as a witness, or the committee determines that in the interest of justice and the economy, with due regard to the importance of presenting oral testimony, that the statement should be used. Yes. I've given you a copy of the committee rules dated April 11th, 1974. Ms. Harris, 78. 78, and you've had a chance to read rule number 4. Yes, I have. And you understand that you have a right to the counsel present during the course of the deposition. I do. And it is your desire to waive the right to have counsel present. That is my desire. Okay, so the direct examination now begins. Let's start, Ms. Harris, by giving us a very brief resume since 1963 of what you have done. I left Dallas shortly thereafter, shortly after the assassination, early 64, I guess, and worked briefly for the Democrat National Committee. Not briefly through the convention of 64 and thereafter. I went back to the Peace Corps, where I had been employed from the inception, roughly the inception of the Peace Corps, until June of 63. When I had gone back to Dallas, which is my home, I left the Peace Corps in 76, subsequently working for the Girl Scouts of the USA. Oh, I guess we can add Girl Scouts to the long list of CIA organizations. I left the Peace Corps in 76, subsequently worked for the Girl Scouts of the USA for 1 year as a special assistant to their director, Then worked for the Urban Institute in Washington, helped set it up. Then went to California to work for Psychology Today, the company publishing the magazine Psychology Today. Came back to New York in early 1971 to start Ms. Magazine. Since that time, I've done a variety of things, including publishing, subsequently, a magazine called Working Women. I basically describe myself as a magazine publisher, and I'm about to do another one, and I have also been very busy in city affairs. In New York? Yes, civic jobs, volunteer jobs, and also doing a lot of political work with the Democrat Party, various aspects of the party. Is that enough? What were you doing in 1963? In 1963, I had lived in Dallas, and I left there to go back to work for the Peace Corps, and I had gone back to Dallas to go back into business. I had been doing public relations down there before the Peace Corps, and I went back and did a little bit of that. I did some work with a man named Sam Bloom, whom I will refer to later, has been an advertising agency down there that's integrating some of the... I was doing, a couple of little things and looking to start a new company, which, because of my decision after the assassination not to stay in Dallas, of course, fell to pieces. But I was looking to start a company to sell insurance to women. During the course of November 63? Yes, I had been doing that during the summer. I came back at the end of June, so I was there July, August, September, and I was prepared to stay to Dallas and to work there, presumably forever, and to stay out of politics, because I recognized politics was a sort of snub in Dallas. I'd been active in the political situation in Dallas prior to my going to the Peace Corps, working for Johnson and Rayburn, and a number of our leaders and I distinctly didn't want to get involved in politics because tempers ran very high. And I was something of a liberal, therefore had nothing to do with it. I knew that Kennedy was coming to town, but chose not to be involved in the arrangements. About a week or so before the actual trip, I got a call from Bill Moyers, whom I know well in Washington. Before Kennedy's scheduled trip? Yes. Bill was, at the time, the Department Associate Director of the Peace Corps, but he had told me he had been called at the White House by Kennedy to participate in unraveling the political snarl that had pertained to Kennedy's planned trip to Texas. He was very quiet about the whole thing, and specifically asked I do not divulge the fact that he was coming to Texas because he didn't want to upset John Connally. He asked me to help him. I said I didn't want to help him. He insisted, and he flew down on a night plane, arriving in Dallas on his way to Austin, arriving in Dallas at, 6 o'clock in the morning. Called me at home, said he was going to take a nap at the airport motel. And we met, I think, around 11:30. I had by that time known he was coming. I spent the afternoon and evening before that trying to dig into exactly what the facts were. I had agreed to do that much for him. What the facts were in terms of the delicate situation because Dallas was causing a great deal of trouble about Kennedy's proposed visits. I wrote him a long memorandum, which I gave that to him the next morning and told him I didn't want to have anything more to do with it. Here are the facts. Go to Austin and God bless. He went down to Austin, as you know, and called me back, as I recall. It was a Thursday. He called me back on a Friday afternoon and said that he had a big problem in Dallas and I was the only one to help him solve it. Bill's a very persuasive young man, and would I please go down and see a man named Sam Bloom? Because Bill knew I knew Sam Bloom because Sam was in charge of the sort of executive director, but Sam was the guy working on behalf of what he might have been called the host committee. What really was the establishment in Dallas, the businessmen who really at the time politically ran the city of Dallas, most of whom were opposed to Kennedy's coming. Sam was refusing. Would those people have been the political element that supported John Connally? Yes, I would say. John was then governor, and and they were very pro-Connally and very anti-Kennedy and very anti-Ralph Yarborough. And they wanted the big battle came over who was going to get tickets to the trademark luncheon, and they felt they did not want Kennedy to come because they were hoping he would be defeated in the next election, and they didn't want to put on a big show for him. They didn't want to do anything to help Yarborough, and they felt that it was their town, and when the president came, he would do as they wanted him to do, and therefore they would dole out tickets as they saw fit. Well, what was happening, there was this tremendous scream coming from the Yarborough, the liberals, who were saying, we are being cut off. And of course, right in the middle of all this was Johnson, who was also vice president. So Sam Bloom was leading the Dallas group. I mean, he was speaking for them. He wasn't making decisions. He had long done that for the group. He had long served in his behind-the-scenes executive capacity for it. I think it was called the Dallas Citizens Council or something like that. It was the group that met many of the leading businessmen, whom I know well, many of them. But they pretty much decided that was going to happen politically in Dallas, and Sam was their loyal, capable worker. He had his own advertising agency, which is now a very large and successful agency. But in any event, because I knew Sam well and because Sam was a little bit put out because there had been so many people coming down from Washington telling him what to do, that he didn't want to have anything to do with this kid named Moyers coming from Austin. The guy that originally come was Jerry Bruno, and Jerry Bruno had a way of throwing his weight around. Then Bruno had disappeared. And then they sat down Jack Putterbaugh, and Jack was from the Department of Agriculture, and he didn't know anything either. Why did they send him down? I have no idea why they found him. Was he a Texan? No, he didn't know, certainly knew nothing about political situation, and he didn't know a great deal about advancing the trip. But so, this further angered Sam, and by the time Moyers came along, I think Sam was abrupt with him. But anyhow, I said, that's how I got involved with this. Bill said, you got to go down and talk to Sam Bloom for me. Well, I reluctantly agreed to go, and from that moment on, I was deeply involved in all their arrangements until the following Friday, because I did know Sam. And therefore, what I had not wanted to do, i.e. be involved, and I spent the full 7 days working full-time on the arrangements from there on in. So that's how I got involved in this whole thing. When you wrote the memorandum to Bill Moyers, did you do any research? Did you talk to any people? Yes, I had spent, he had told me the day before I had about 24 hours, and he definitely was coming, and so I undertook to go out that afternoon and evening and get on the telephone and find out what the political situation was. I knew a lot of people in Dallas, and I sat down and did research report on who was fighting who, and who was mad at who, and who wanted to do it this way, and who was objecting to that, etc. When you talked with Bill Moyers on the phone, he did express knowledge of that, the people and the facts. Well, Bill understood Texas politics in a general way. And Bill's a very bright person, and he had a general idea of what the problem was. He did not know the specifics because he never really lived in Dallas. And so what I had done was to do just a thorough research, telling him who the people were, what they did, and defining the basic problem. And the basic problem was, very simply, that the conservative Democrats, who were the city fathers, didn't want anything to do with for the liberal Democrats, who were led by Ralph Yarborough as the incumbent senator, and the two groups were fighting over the distribution of tickets. Less important was the less open fighting about the amount of publicity that was going to be given to the liberal, the liberals wanted some publicity to turn out the crowds. They wanted big crowds for political reasons. They wanted it to look like Kennedy was terribly popular in Dallas, and the conservatives wanted a poor crowd because they wanted to look like he wasn't very popular in Dallas. So there was some arguments going on between how much staff would be in the papers. The papers were pretty well controlled by the Sam Bloom group, and the liberals were screaming and yelling that there wasn't enough publicity they wanted. Why did the conservatives and liberals understand that Kennedy came to Dallas in the first place and was planning to come? As I recall the reason, it was purely political. Everybody understood that it was a political trip to shore up what, at that point in time, looked like a decline in the president's popularity. It always happens, but after about 2 years in office, the president always sinks down to the bottom of the polls. Texas was very touchy on the subject of Kennedy, of course, really. Texas and Illinois carried the country for Kennedy. If you go back and look at the elections in 60 and 61, and that is another story. But the conservatives wanted to show that in spite of the fact that Texans, by the slimmest of margins, had gone for Kennedy in 60, and that he was no longer popular, the liberals, on the other hand, wanted to show that he was too popular, and it's as simple as that. Do you understand that John Connally, or who was then Governor Connally, invited the president to come to Texas? No, I had not understood that. I did not understand that it was an open invitation to say, come down. I understood that John had reluctantly acquiesced. Let me pause right there. So we know for a fact Jack Valenti sent the invite to John Kennedy to invite him to the Albert Thomas dinner, right? That was the hook, to bring him to Texas. And from there, the rest of the stops were generated for him to have a full trip, right? So, yeah, Jack Valenti sent the letter. Connally had nothing to do with it, although he might have had to give some sort of tacit approval at some point. So you got involved with the political groups about 10 days before the scheduled trip was planned to Dallas. Yes, it was actually about 8 days. Because I think Bill came to town Thursday morning. That would be Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, count the days. And one of the things you remember the most significant was the fighting about who was going to get tickets at the Trade Mart. That and the publication of the route. When did that happen? Well, let's see. That was happening. That was one of the things Bill wanted me to get into by Monday or Tuesday of the following week. We had a confrontation meeting with John. There was, as I recall, Governor Connally, yes, and Bob Strauss. And the guy I was working with most closely was the Secret Service man named Winston Lawson. Excellent reference here to Winston Lawson because it goes to show how much, how involved Winston Lawson actually was in this thing, which is amazing. Because I didn't realize that he was involved in all these meetings here. Yes, and he, of course, was totally neutral. But I do remember a meeting that took place with one of the side of the table and John, and I think, and Bob Strauss and Sam Bloom on the other, arguing over the route, arguing over publication of the route, and publicity attended to the whole thing because they distinctly wanted to keep it very quiet. Bloom had arranged not to have the route published in the papers. I blew my stack at that. I said, I don't care what you guys think. These are all my friends, understand, although we are at opposite sides of the table. I was very sincere and open on this thing and said, this is the president of the United States and this city. I don't care whether you like him or not. He's the only president we got. And finally, I think my pressure was responsible, which I had to cause to have regret about, was the forced publication of that route. They were not going to publish it until Friday morning. So Sam finally decided to publish it. All right, let me pause right here. Once again, who published the route? Who relayed the information to the papers to publish the route? It was Jack Valenti. And obviously, we have a phone call made from Elizabeth Forsling Harris, or possibly Sam Bloom, to Weekly and Valenti, and then Weekly and Valenti published the route on November 18th. You get all kinds of fucking idiot conspiracy fucks saying they changed the motorcade route. They changed the... No, they fucking didn't. They didn't change shit. Okay? They didn't publish anything until November 18th, and on November 18th, they published the accurate motorcade fucking route. Dumb fuck conspiracy theorist assholes. Pushing propaganda fucking pissed me off. Jesus fucking Christ. This is what happened, okay? Once it was published on November 18th, that's it. All right, back to the document. Sorry about that. When was it published? Either Wednesday or Thursday. It was published ahead of time. I wanted it published ahead of time because that helps get the crowd out. I can go into all the efforts that were made. What's the word I want? Protection security. That's a different subject. I would like to discuss that eventually, but let's talk about the route selection itself. Was there any division about which way Kennedy would take to get to the Trade Mart? Yes, initially. Excuse me. You're familiar with the layout in the airports here. Love Field, the Trade Mart roughly is here, and downtown Dallas is here. The idea of the optimum was that they wanted to bring him from Love Field directly to the Trade Mart, which is an area that goes past very little populated area. Would that have been down Hines Boulevard? Straight down Hines, and you missed, therefore, all this residential area and the Dallas Business District if you come that way. Do you follow me? Yes. So there was much back and forth and much conversation, not just with me, but with people in Washington and with Moyers, etc., too, instead of coming from point 1 to point 2, to come all the way through Maple Avenue, around, down Acreage Street, then hit Main Street, go back under the viaduct, and then out. In other words, go downtown. To go through the populated area, if they had come directly from Love Field to the Trade Mart via Hines Boulevard, there would have been relatively few people who would have seen the president because people won't go that far. The idea was to turn out as many crowds as possible. And we were afraid people wouldn't bother to drive, whereas if we were brought him down Main Street, right down through downtown Dallas, approximately shortly thereafter noontime, then we get to the lunchtime crowd. We get all the people coming out of the office buildings, etc. We also get all the people. We came through a rather heavy residential section, and indeed we did. And we were arguing about those two strategies. How emphatically did Connally insist on using the Hines Boulevard route? Well, not totally emphatically, because obviously it was decided to go this way. But there was an awful lot of discussion and an awful lot of short tempers before it was finally reluctantly determined that they would bring them around the long route. But beginning, I have to emphasize that this was political horseplay. It was not, it was, at least I never determined, obviously, any other reasons why they would object. My side bigger than your side was the argument. Did they understand that your side representing the president certainly was much bigger than the other side representing the state's political level? Not down in Texas. We weren't in Texas. We were distinctly the minority. I was working for Moyers, and he was working for the White House. And so, and quite clearly, Bill and I understood each other completely. We wanted a big turnout for Kennedy, and it was up to me to express as firm a position as I could in all of these meetings on behalf of what the White House wanted. And as I said, the White House was doing some of its own talking, and Moyers was doing his own talking. And I was the sort of point man on the front. And between all of us, it was finally agreed that he would come come the long way around. Do you know when that was decided? How many days in advance? We were arguing as late as Tuesday, which would have been before the Friday trip, and it was finally determined that they would indeed, when I came on board, which would have been the Friday before, they were still not entirely sure that it was going to be at the Trade Mart. But that decision was finally agreed to over the weekend. Then we had the big hassle over the route. As I remember all of this, and you must remember this was 15 years ago, and finally determined that, and then we got into an argument over the publication of the route. Were you involved in deciding whether or not the luncheon site was going to be at the Trade Mart? That decision, that was decided before you actually got involved. Yes. Who was representing the White House at those discussions? Putterbaugh, myself, and Wynne Lawson. But his position, and Moyers by telephone, and through Moyers, Frank Irwin, and I don't know where Irwin came in. I never met Frank Irwin. He was in Austin this whole time, but he was obviously being touched base with, and he was in touch with Connolly and Strauss, who lived in Dallas, was sort of Connolly's man in town on this thing. And Bob dealt with the guy who was, I can't remember his name. He was then president of Tom Thumb Stores or some guy who was a chief spokesman for the city, and whom Sam Bloom was immediately accountable. All right, let me pause for a second right here. There's a name here that's not familiar to me. That's seemingly going to have to become familiar to me. And that name is Frank Irwin. So, Tony, make sure to note Frank Irwin on our list, please. All right, let's continue. What were the considerations about using the Trade Mart, the women's building? The women's building was discussed at the fairgrounds, if you remember. I don't really remember a great deal about that. There was some discussion about general convenience for everybody concerned, and some discussion about the fact that in order to get to the fairgrounds, it was the farthest away from Love Field. You have to remember that there was a time factor because the Kennedy party was on a very tight timetable. They left Fort Worth, came over to Dallas, where to do Dallas quickly and have lunch there, and then get to Austin, where there was going to be a big dinner in the state capitol. So that the matter of how much time he was going to spend in the motorcade from the airport to whatever point the luncheon was going to be held in Dallas, and then getting back the motorcade to the airport to get to the plane to get to Austin on time came into play. And partly, I think, as I recall, the reason that was made to have it at the Trade Mart instead of the women's building at the fairgrounds was that it would take much less time to get after the lunch, to get from the luncheon back to the airport than if they go clear over across town at the state fairgrounds. It would have taken to get to the motorcade from the women's building back would have probably taken a good 45 minutes time, where it was 6-7 minutes from the Trade Mart. So I think that had a hand in it. There was some argument by some people over the fact that it should be in the women's building because that was state-owned facility, whereas the Dallas Trade Mart was a privately owned facility. Very important there. I'd say that's pretty key. The owners being connected to Permindex and the CIA, of course. What about the people who would come? Well, there was also another reason that was raised at one point, which was going back to the ticket distribution, was that if it were at the Trade Mart, if it was privately funded, if it was a private location, and therefore a conservative element would have greater control over the tickets than if it were in a public facility, where they would have given tickets to those Yarborough types. So that, in a sense, the decision to make it go over to the Trade Mart was a political victory for the conservatives. Now John Connolly was there in Texas. Did anybody represent Yarborough? No, I got stuck with that, finally, at the last. That is a matter of equity. Oh, yes, and I knew Ralph, and I had been there. He was a man in Dallas whose name I cannot remember at the moment, whom I know quite well, who was a lawyer and who always regarded as Yarborough's Dallas man. You may run across his name. I would recognize it if you told me. But a very nice guy, slight man, about 60, I guess, 65, a slender, sandy-haired, freckled-faced, bespectacled guy who was Yarborough's man. And he said I had several conversations, and he was mostly groveling for tickets, and I, through Moyers, did finally get him some tickets. Now, tickets to the luncheon or tickets to the fundraiser? Tickets to the luncheon. Okay. Which then I doled out to the proper so-called liberal types. Now, before the final decision was made to publicize the route, did you confer with anyone in the White House? I talked to Moyers about it, and what was his position? Well, he and I were furious because he wanted the publicity, and I talked to Moyers, I would suspect, about every 2 hours for those whole 7 days, we were constantly on the phone to each other, and with Bill's encouragement, that I made a lot of noise to Bloom, demanding that the route be run, and it finally was. I think the Times-Herald ran it first, and I have a vague feeling that the Times-Herald ran it on Wednesday afternoon's edition, and the News ran it right next to the morning on Thursday morning, as opposed to the original plan, which had been to only hold it for the News on Friday morning, which would have held down the crowd. Now, Win Lawson was the person representing the Secret Service. What role did he play? Win was down there. He was, I guess you would say, as I understood it, his job was to check out all of the details, to liaise with the local police department, and also beyond that to make sure all of the arrangements were as his superiors in Washington wanted to have them. So that he didn't get too much into the political aspect of it all. All he wanted was a nuts and bolts man, and he worked very closely with Jesse Curry, who was the police chief. So one thing I'm really gaining from this document is you're getting to see, obviously she's not going to sit here and tell you we plotted to kill the president, right? And you're never going to see on any fucking document ever. We sat around and talked about killing the president, except from guys like Beckham in New Orleans and shit, right? So when it comes to any of these official people or CIA people, they'll never admit to fucking anything. They'll never give you an inch. But one thing they'll do inadvertently is they'll give you the list of people they associate with, and it's those lists of associations that are everything. Like fucking everything, right? So here, what I'm getting from her, she's giving us all the names that are important. Jesse Curry, Win Lawson, right? She's naming all the names of the people who are central, involved in making sure that the motorcade route is set to go through Dealey Plaza, regardless of what she says here. Was Win Lawson in on the discussion about the timing of the publicity and the route selection? I can't recall, because his being part of on the publicity about the publication of the route, he was, of course, concerned about the route selection because of, at the time, and B, to a lesser extent, the security factor. It would have meant an even bigger security job to get Kennedy all the way over to the Women's Building. Did those things come up in the discussions you held with the Connolly people? Yes, we had this. I was constantly in touch with Sam Bloom, who for the purposes of, I would regard as a Connolly person, and then, as I said, we had this one meeting at the Republic National Bank building. I know Bob Strauss was there. That's another name to keep note of. He had been my lawyer and good friend, and I think John was there, as I recall. And this would have been either Monday or Tuesday of that week. And it's where we got down to a bit of name-calling on the subject of both the route, the publication, the ticket distribution, and the whole thing. How seriously were the protective elements discussed, the security of the president? Did anyone think that was a topic to be considered? Yes, there was a great deal of discussion about it, the thing they were all afraid of at that point, certainly Kennedy types like myself. We were all very concerned over the radical conservative element. You remember General Walker, who had been fired on, and we knew that there was a lot of what I would call conservative kooks, and we were very concerned that there were going to be, everybody was, including Bloom and I, everybody was concerned that some nut was going to get a gun and take a shot at the president. So a great deal of time and effort was spent, particularly by Lawson, with the police. And it was always my understanding that they had located most of the known troublemakers, the unhinged conservative types that might pick up a gun and do something, that they were under house arrest or surveillance the day Kennedy arrived. In other words, the police knew who some of these people were, and they told them to stay in their houses and put a policeman out there to watch. I don't know. The other thing was that Sam Bloom decided that they wanted to park what I called a Black Maria, one of those police vans where they pick up prisoners conspicuously along a route, particularly wherever the motorcade turned outside the Trade Mart and other such places, because we were afraid there might be some demonstrations, and that we were prepared to put these police vans out there and to serve as a deterrent, but if necessary, to pick up the wilder demonstrators if needed. That was to be. I objected vehemently to that because I said, this is the president, and some of us will be on television. You can't, in Dallas, Texas, make it look like that a president of the United States can't come down without it resembling a police state. And they finally decided not to put those very obvious black vans out at all. These individuals, were they to be picked up by the television camera, there again, my consideration was, I thought they were just gliding a lily. I was all for keeping these conservatives under surveillance, but I thought that was carrying it a bit too far, and I finally won that. Did you also have it firm in your mind that Ambassador Stevenson, Adlai Stevenson, I guess, had been insulted just some short weeks before? Yes, he had been spat upon. He had been at what they call the Convention Center, then Coliseum, that new building. Yes, I was aware of that. We knew that. Again, however, we put the onus on the radical conservative element, of which there were, you've got to remember, you are young, both of you. You've got to remember that in 1963, it was very hard for anybody to recognize that anything worse than a spitting incident would occur. I was extremely anxious, and Moyers and I frequently discussed this. We wanted to bend over backwards to avoid another Stevenson episode because it had gotten tremendous publicity, and we felt it would be not at all in Kennedy's interest for a thing like that to happen. Except for the kooks that might go out with a gun, I can't say that it would ever occur to any of us that there would be the death occurred. We were worried more about appearances. Well, you knew that General Walker had insisted that an attempt on his life had been an assassination attempt. Yes, we knew that he had said that. Did you have an understanding that may have been the kook who attempted to shoot him? Yes. I mean, obviously, it's an unstable person who would attempt to assassinate anybody, whereas General Walker had made himself undesirable to certain elements in Dallas. We did know that he had been shot at and considered it an assassination attempt, but we, once again, assumed this was a disgruntled member of his own group. As one does in a situation like this, yes. We knew that, and we were, as I said, Lawson and I were very well aware of it because I saw Lawson quite often, and we worked late, and I met some of the other Secret Service people who eventually arrived. So Elizabeth Forsling Harris directly in contact with numerous Secret Service members. Good to know. But I knew that he was working with Curry on getting a fix on the known troublemakers. So here we have Curry, who was definitely in on this. Everybody's in on this, okay? So we've got to just put that as a baseline. But when Lawson working directly with Curry, with Elizabeth Forsling Harris, who's directly in contact with Jack Valenti, do you see these it's all about relationships, right? I don't give a fuck what you can prove, they said in conversations. You're never going to be able to prove in conversations that they organize a fucking hit on the president, right? But it's just the knowing of the associations in and of themselves are sufficient to establish the relationships and the direct line between Washington and the assassins, right? In Dallas. Did you have any contact with any city other than Dallas in arrangements you were making? No, except through Bill. I mean, I would hear through Bill. Bill was really pivotal, and he was very pleased that I was somewhat interested, but really only tangibly in the Fort Worth arrangements because my responsibilities picked up as soon as they left Fort Worth, and therefore it was of concern to me when they were going to leave Fort Worth and what the travel schedule was. And I remember Bill had worked very hard to set up labor meetings in the parking lot. And the last conversation I had with Bill was that he was so pleased that it had worked out so well right on time and that Kennedy was coming into town on schedule and so on and so forth. But aside, as far as making any of the arrangements, no, I had nothing to do with those. All right. So I'm going to go ahead, guys, and I'm going to push on through, and we're going to wrap this up today. Give me 2 minutes. I'm going to run and grab a glass of water real quick, and I shall be right back. All right. Do you remember any conversations from that time about Governor Conley requesting that TCU or Texas Christian University extend the doctorate degree to President Kennedy? No, I don't. What about Kenny O'Donnell? Did you ever have correspondence with him? No. After in the hospital room, where were you about noon? My place at noon was out at the airport with everybody, and I was out in the tarmac waiting for the plane to come in and go over. First thing I said was, the Johnson plane came in ahead of the Kennedy plane, and so I went over and walked and labored the Johnsons around and met them, and walked over to where they were to line up to greet the Kennedys. But when they came down the steps when their plane landed, then I went back over to and stood with the man who I think he was a Forrest somebody. Sorrells? He was FBI or Secret Service. And it was at that point that we decided to take the bubble off the car because Bill had been on the phone saying Kennedy doesn't want a bubble, and the Secret Service people said they wanted a bubble on because it was going to rain, and Bill's last word to me was, get that goddamn bubble off unless it's pouring rain. Well, I stood out there after getting Johnson settled at Love Field, looked over there, and the sun was coming out, and I said to Sorrells, let's tell them to take the bubble off, which they did. And then I stood there marshaling various people to get in the right cars and so on and so forth. And I had a bus where I was to take the senior staff. We were traveling with both the president and vice president. And that bus, I was supposed to swing it in. I wasn't driving it, but swing it in behind the Secret Service car, behind Johnson's. And as I got everybody loaded in there, they got a little bit too late. And as a consequence, all the congressional delegation that was accompanying Kennedy got in their car, got in ahead of us. And I had with me, this is where it gets important. We had Lincoln, Mrs. Kennedy's 2 women, Liz Carpenter from Johnson's staff, several other people whose name I don't remember, a couple of local people. And we then got to the bus in the motorcade and went off toward the Trade Mart. Okay, so this is where things are really fucked up, because this is where her lies start to begin. Number 1, Elizabeth Forsling Harris is not on the White House documentation as having been in the motorcade at all. Period. End of story. Not at all. She claims to have been on this bus here, which was supposed to get in line behind Johnson's in the Secret Service car, right? There was a bus. It ended up being the first of several press buses, not an executive bus or a VIP bus. Okay? The bus that she's describing, as per the motorcade information, is 24th in line. It's the Continental Silver Eagle, right? The Lincoln Continental, not a Lincoln, it was the Continental Silver Eagle that allegedly Jack Valenti is on and all these other people. And coming up here shortly, she's going to try to give another alibi to Jack Valenti. But obviously Jack Valenti was not where he said he was. He was not on the bus. But the things that she's describing here are ironic, because this is in my book. This is all detailed in chapter 6 of my book. Every single one of the women's secretaries, and we're talking Mary Gallagher, Marie Femmer, we're talking Liz Carpenter, we're talking Evelyn Lincoln, and then there's one more, I forget her name offhand. There's 5 of them, okay? All 5 of them, their stories all jive with each other. They all corroborate each other. Just the 5 of them. Just the 5 women's secretaries. Okay? But then you have both Jack Valenti and Elizabeth Forsling Harris claiming to have been on the same bus as them, which would have been 24th in line, making their way to the Trade Mart. And then at the Trade Mart, they tell a story about commandeering a cop car, piling into the front and back seats, and then heading over to Parkland. Well, the problem is, like I've already said, the 5 women's secretaries, their stories jive 100%. They're completely intact. They support each other, and I know exactly what happened. The 5 secretaries got into the car with the deputy sheriff or the state trooper, whoever the fuck it was, named Good, and they head over to Parkland. However, Elizabeth Forsling Harris and Jack Valenti both attempt to insert themselves into that story. And according to Elizabeth Forsling Harris and Jack Valenti, they wedge themselves in the front seat. The front seat. And Elizabeth Forsling Harris says that she had her face wedged up against the passenger side glass, right? Well, that means that, according to her, 5 people were in a bench front seat. Does that make any sense? No, you're not fitting 5 people in the front bench seat of a cop car. End of story, okay? You can't do that. You can fit 3. So her statement's a lie, Jack Valenti's statement's a lie, and I just had to clarify that as we move on. So the only thing that's relevant about that, when we got down to starting to go under to make that right turn left turn by the book depository, I was aware that something had happened because they had speeded up. And I remember saying to Lincoln, she noticed it too. And I said, don't worry. Then when we pulled past the now famous grassy knoll and I saw people running, I realized that something had happened, but still not exactly precisely. Had you heard any shots? No, we were too far back. That was the point of the thing. We were, I guess, 4 to 5 cars behind the president's car. 6 cars. No. See, this is it again. This is it again. This is bullshit. No, we were too far back. That was the point of the thing. We were, I guess, 4 or 5 cars behind the president's car. 6 cars. No, you fucking weren't. You lying cunt. You were 24th in line. And you would know that if you were actually fucking there. But you weren't. You were retroactively fed this fucking story as an alibi. Otherwise, you would know you were 24th in line, not 6th. The first I realized there was anything the matter was when I saw a rather fat, corpulent police captain running. And it occurred to me that police captains don't run unless something's gone wrong. But I kept it to myself, and then because we had local identification, and Wynne Lawson did not have his at the airport and said, give me your local thing. You won't need it. I gave it to him. When we got back out to the door of the Trade Mart, I was going to bring the staff in the back door for the purposes of speed. They wouldn't let us in because I didn't have my local identification. And while we were standing there arguing with the policeman, somebody rushed up and said, the president's been shot. And I then called immediately the newspaper. Pause right there. So, this again is contradicted by the article that Elizabeth Forsling Harris published in November of 1988, where she specifically talks about getting off of this bus and then leading all of these women, not mentioning Jack Valenti once, by the way, all the way into the building, in through the kitchen of the Trade Mart to their seats. That's what she says she did. That's not what she said she did here. This is the problem with fucking lying. You don't remember your lies. You don't remember your lies. And so you have to tell new ones. And that's how you get caught. And that's how Elizabeth Forsling Harris is being caught right fucking now. Which newspaper? Dallas News. And it was confirmed that he was shot. That was, you called the newspaper. I called to find out. This guy had rushed in very upset, as anybody was. The president's been shot. The president's been shot. And it obviously threw this little group into a tizzy. And before we did anything, I felt I had to confirm it. And I called the paper when it was confirmed, sort of in a daze. I went out and commandeered a state trooper car, and he took us to the hospital. And that was why about 5 of us got in there very quickly. Jack Valenti. Here we go. She's starting to give the alibi to Jack Valenti. Right here. The 3 Kennedy women and myself and Liz Carpenter. Then, of course, by that time, we knew indeed it was true. Okay, so we have 3 Kennedy women. Then we have her, Liz Carpenter. Jack Valenti is 6. But no, she's forgetting about Mary Femmer. She's forgetting about Mary Femmer. Okay? Not only is she forgetting about Mary Femmer, she's talking about, she's the one who commandeered the state trooper car. Sort of in a daze, I went out and commandeered the state trooper car, and he took us to the hospital. Fuck you! Fuck you! Fuck you! Okay? We have 3 fucking people at this point in history claiming to have commandeered the state trooper car. 3. Okay? 1, 2, 3. Jack Valenti, in his fucking statements, clearly states he commandeered a sheriff's car. Elizabeth Forsling Harris is clearly stating she commandeered the state trooper's car. But then Mary Femmer, Johnson's secretary, is the one who originally made that fucking statement. She's the only one that I can guarantee was on the fucking VIP bus with all these women. She is one of 5 women who went to the fucking Trade Mart who commandeered this fucking state trooper's car. The state trooper's name is Good. Goode. She Mary Femmer, remember, because she had his fucking card. Okay? This is pure fucking lies on behalf of Elizabeth Forsling Harris. She did not commandeer shit. She was never at the Trade Mart. She was never with Jack Valenti. And the whole reason she's giving this statement is to provide an alibi for Jack Valenti once again. When you saw Mrs. Kennedy in the hospital, where was she? You know, it was a T-shaped room, and there were 2 or 3 little rooms along here. 2 rooms where they had Kennedy and Conley, and she's seated right there, here in front of them, kind of in the middle on the floor. Outside the room? Outside the room. It was a very traumatized state. In the chair or on the floor? In the chair, where she sat almost the entire time, except for when she was in there to see him. The ring business and everything. Very shaken and covered with his brains and blood. And Dave Powers would come over occasionally and squeeze her shoulders. She didn't even recognize Rick Gallagher, Mary Gallagher, Pamela Turner, her own staff people. And she was just, you know, almost out of it, understandably so, as was everybody in the place. When you were in the motorcade and before you reached Houston Street, do you remember the motorcade stopping at all? Well, you've got to remember, we were in a big bus and buses, and we were all elated, all of us, with the huge crowds. And as we came down Main Street and we moved down Main Street, the bus driver would move a little bit. Then he would almost stop and shift gears and move on just because of the slow pace of the motorcade and the difficulty of moving one of those great big buses. I do remember kind of coming to a stop almost to the place just before we made the turn, which was at the point where Evelyn Lincoln said, "What's happened?" They've gone ahead of us. And I looked and I could see the president's car moving very rapidly. Okay, here's another lie. She was 24th in line. She was not in a party bus 7th or 8th behind the president's car. So once again, she's saying she could look and see the president's car moving rapidly. No, she couldn't. No, she couldn't. She was a half mile behind the president's car. And we did sort of stop at that point. I mean, we did entirely stop. Actually, and he was making that sharp turn, but I assumed that was simply because they were trying to make up time because we were late according to our schedule, but we had to run into many more crowds. I forgot what the exact times were, but we had a time figured out and we were behind. And I just assumed they were speeding it up now because they passed the area where there was a lot of people lining the streets. Did you see anyone standing in the road at Elm? Elm? I've been saying Elm? You came down Main. Turn onto Houston and then onto Elm. That's right. Did I see anybody standing in the street? Yes. By that time, I remember seeing somebody picking themselves up off the sidewalk. They had been thrown themselves down, face down. I saw that police captain running. Which direction was he running? He was running toward what is now known as the grassy knoll. I saw another policeman who had turned over his motorbike, who was picking it up to move it someplace, and I realized something had happened. But I must say that I did not. I suppose maybe somebody had fired a shot or something, but it never occurred to me that the president had been hit very clearly. I don't know how to describe this, but after those few seconds, you could tell that there was something that had happened and disrupted in the crowd, and I remembered afterwards that I realized that something had happened, and as I was sitting on the left-hand side of the bus so that the area just below to see the book depository, etc., I had to look across the bus, but I remember the fact that something had upset the crowd. Did you actually ever get in the trademark building itself? No, because when I found out, when I was also to ascertain that the president had been shot, I knew a lot of those people. But a lot of those people at the City Desk News at Dallas knew my name. So when I told them, they told me the president had been shot and taken to Parkland. So we turned, immediately went out and found this police car with a policeman who was parked there. He had been planning to do something. It was a state trooper's car, and he took us to the hospital. Otherwise, we would never have gotten to the hospital because he turned his siren on. Ms. Harris, you were in Dallas, well, you mentioned for some time in '63, and you were familiar with at least generally most of the political factions. Did you have any understanding of the left-wing type of politics in Dallas? When you say left-wing, can you define your term a little more? Did you have any understanding of the Cubans and their participation, if any, in Dallas politics? No, I did not. I did not know of any Cubans who were involved at all. I knew George de Mohrenschildt. All right, let's pause right here. I knew George de Mohrenschildt. I knew George de Mohrenschildt and his wife slightly. How is it that you know him? And why the fuck would she volunteer that information? I think that's like a CIA tactic. You just give all kinds of information that they hope will never be able to put the dots together on. This is ridiculous, really. She should never have fucking admitted that. Well, for a while, I lived at a place called Maple Terrace Apartments, which had a swimming pool that was available to the tenants as well as some people who had bought club membership in it. And they did, and I knew them through a little tiny bit socially and had one or two political discussions with him and regarded him as a kind of interesting but wild Russian who had some wild political ideas. But that was, of the people that were subsequently involved on that side of the fence, he was the only one I had known. I had never known, as I said, any Cubans, and I knew that there were some. Not only knew that there were some, I knew that there were some very liberals. There were some liberals, and they were all local Dallasites. Do you know any of the followers of George de Mohrenschildt, who were some of his closest associates were? No, he was kind of a mystery man. No, he was kind of a mystery man. Do you understand his background? Not very much. We knew that he was Russian. We knew that his wife was a second or third wife and that he was a Russian businessman or a man with Russian extractions doing some business in Dallas. And it was interesting, but I didn't know anything about his background. Was there a prominent Russian community? No. So he was considered as sort of a, well, oddity, if you will. Yes, clearly. He wasn't a native Texan, but an interestingly enough fellow. His wife probably attracted the greatest attention because she was not terribly slender, but she wore in those days something that raised quite an eyebrow. She wore a bikini, and she was well padded, and that raised a lot of eyebrows. That's funny. They were friends of, there was a Polish community here, a small Polish community there. They were friends. There was Lawia Varsovie, and the man and his wife that ran that were Polish. She had been a Polish actress. Damn, I can't even think of her names. I can find them for you. And I knew them quite well, Stan. His first name was Stan. I will think of his last name in a minute. And they hired ex-Poles and ex-East Europeans. If there were any East Europeans, which de Mohrenschildt was one, they kind of gathered behind that group. Lawia Varsovie at the time was the best restaurant in Dallas. Slawic, Slawic was their name. And they knew the Des Moines Shields. So that there was really a Polish community that had to do with East Europeans came, but it was certainly not a Russian community. Did you know William McKenzie, attorney in Dallas? No. Were you familiar with the corporation known as Great Southwest Corporation? I certainly was. What was your familiarity with that corporation? Angus Wynn. I don't know that name. When? I have known several of the people that started Great Southwest Corporation. I knew them. I knew that what they were doing. I was not familiar with Six Flags. I was with Six Flags. Now, let me come to this. There was a guy named Wes, and he was a New Yorker who moved down there, who was then a lawyer. His last name was West. His first name was Wes. I knew him quite well. I don't know why you asked me this, but let me tell you how this figured into the whole thing. He was an associate of Wynn's and indeed was responsible at the time, and a lawyer, and of the lawyer's point of view, was pretty much responsible for the Six Flag, the inn of the Six Flags. A few days after the assassination, he called me because he knew I had been involved with this whole thing, to say he was very, very concerned over what was happening over the inn of the Six Flags because the FBI had brought out Marina Oswald. Was that his words? Yes. Yes. No. He asked, okay, this is something the CIA people do this all the time. Was that his words? Yes. Yes. No. Which is it? Fucking yes or no. Okay? He asked me to come out to Arlington for lunch, which I did, to the inn, and told me that they brought her out there. He was very critical of the way in which they had transported her, attracting a great deal of attention along the way. They put her in a car, and they had 2 or 3 cars, and apparently, I'm quoting him now, the FBI had guns, and they had waved them, and actually had been seen by the people on the highway leading out there, and he felt that he was very critical of the FBI. That he put her out in one of the rooms at the Inn of the Six Flags and had her under guard. He was very concerned about the way the FBI was comporting themselves. Did he understand that it was the FBI or the Secret Service? He understood it was the FBI. I was sufficiently concerned because I had every reason to respect him. He wasn't a troublemaker. He wasn't a publicity seeker. He was a good, solid guy. I called Washington on this. And as I recall, I spoke to Bill Moyers and Abe Foyers. Abe was a very close friend of mine, and as you know, is very close to Johnson and Abe. Bill and I had many conversations the first 2 or 3 days after the assassination when things literally totally had fallen apart. Anyhow, and I reported this and said I was very concerned because the town was very nervous, and Wes was a very reasonable guy, and I don't know what Bill did with the invitation. He sort of laughed at me, Abe did, and said, well, now you know the truth about the FBI, which is typical. Or whoever said the FBI knew what they were doing. And I heard nothing more about this ever. But I did sort of wonder about that because Wes was not the kind of person who would have made this up. He was concerned over the fact that the FBI was going out of the way to attract attention to this woman, who they were hiding out for their own protection. So that's the only way that the Great Southwest and Angus Wynn, as far as I'm concerned, came into this. Now, Mr. Wynn was very displeased about the fact that the inn of the Six Flags was used. I didn't talk to Angus about it. The guy's name, I can't recall his associate. His first name was Wesley. It was he. I did not talk to Angus Wynn. He's speaking for, I guess, the company. Is that what you understood? He was speaking for the company? Yes. Why was it that he was talking to you? Because he knew me. Because he knew we were social friends. Again, he knew my political interests. He knew that I had been involved in the arrangements before the assassination. And he also knew that, I guess, after on Saturday morning, a few of us pulled ourselves together because we thought the town had gone literally bonkers. There were about 10 of us. A guy named Ray Nasher, the dean of SMU Law School, a minister named Luther Holcomb, 2 or 3 other people, I can't remember all of them. And we waited for Stanley Marcus to come back. He had not been in town. To try to bring what thought was some sense to the city in terms and to the leaders in terms of its response to this terrible tragedy that had taken place. And Wes knew that I was part of that group, which is why he called me. Who was the person you were waiting for? I was waiting for where? That the group was waiting for. Oh, Stanley Marcus. Who was that? At the point president? Chairman of Neiman Marcus, which is, I guess, the most celebrated store in Dallas. But in any event, Stanley was and I guess he still is, regarded as a liberal leader in Dallas and a man who sometimes spoke in higher circles, which would be the liberal political point of view. We all also knew, but not that well, that they were talking too much. Stanley had been a leader for many, many years in shaping the image of Dallas through not only the store, but what he stood for and so on and so forth. He was highly respected. We felt that this group felt that Dallas's reputation was being even further as a city, even further diminished by the kind of self-protective attitude of the people who were the leaders who were complaining that it wasn't Dallas's fault. And we're saying some things. You've got to remember the world press moved in on Dallas and they were saying things that we thought were damaging both to the city's reputation, to Kennedy's reputation, and to the Democrat Party's reputation. But we all felt that we had to wait and discuss this with Stanley before he did anything. We asked him, and he went ultimately to Eric Johnson to try to get them to cool a little. I don't think he succeeded very well, but that's why we were waiting for Stanley. And we, at this point, it was pitifully small group of people who were leaders in the community who were willing to take what might be called the pro-Kennedy side of this whole thing. Such was the among the leadership, such was the shock and guilt and whatever else you want to call it, of the Citizens Council and the group that had indeed been running the event. A brief recess was taken. All right. So let's just recap what we've covered here so far. So ultimately, Elizabeth Forsling Harris is going over in pretty explicit detail the people that she was involved with in setting up of the motorcade and whether or not they were going to release the motorcade information. We've pretty much debunked the idea so far that they ever changed the motorcade route. They didn't. It's ridiculous. Drives me up a fucking wall every time I hear these idiots say that. They didn't release the motorcade till the 18th, and it was seemingly done at the insistence of Elizabeth Forsling Harris. And the company that released the motorcade route was Weekly and Valenti, right? So obviously, she doesn't mention this here, but obviously she was in contact with Weekly and Valenti via Jack Valenti in order to have them contact the papers to publish the motorcade route. Pretty cut and dry. A lot of these other names that she's brought up I'm not familiar with. And see, for a researcher like me, it's a matter of how much time and effort should be put into researching these names and for what end, right? Are these micro pieces of the puzzle that belong in the story? Yeah, they sure are. Do I have much bigger fish to fry? You goddamn right I do. You goddamn right I do. All right. What was the name of the person who told you this story you related off the record? The man who told me this story is the man named Maurice Levy, called Mo Levy by everyone who knew him, who was a stinker for NBC television now. Okay, so during this recess, it becomes apparent that she just told them a story off the record, which is not going to be published in here. And now they're questioning her about that. So Maurice Levy, Tony, write that name down. We're going to have to dig into this guy. Maurice Levy seems to be a name that I'm going to have to know because they don't want to tell the story here. The man you told the story to, named Maurice Levy, called Mo Levy by everyone who knew him, who was a stinker for NBC television news. Where is he now? He's dead. He died 3 or 4 years ago of natural causes. When did he talk to you? I knew him. He, of course, having been covering the Kennedy trip a day or two afterwards, probably the following Monday or Tuesday after the assassination. Mo told me the following story, which was that Jack Ruby, whom the world then knew, but whom none of us, Mo had known, had on Friday done what he had always did, was to place an ad in the Dallas News for his place called a striptease joint called the Theater Lounge. Inevitably, Ruby was in the habit of being late. So late, the guy who accepted the ads from him just held the space for him, and then when he wandered in late on Friday afternoon, he put the ad in for the Sunday paper. Well, see, all that's fucking blatantly incorrect. All that's blatantly incorrect. So, why she's bringing up Jack Ruby beats the fuck out of me. She's probably, the story she relayed had to do with Jack Ruby, so that's probably why she's covering it here. But they don't tell us the story that she relayed. Now we're just getting the after effects from it. But it was obviously the Carousel Club. It wasn't the Theater Lounge. And Ruby wasn't late. She said he didn't show up till the afternoon. That's bullshit. He was there from 10:45 in the morning. So, I don't know what the fuck she's talking about. On November 22nd, and very uncharacteristically, Ruby was right on time. The deadline was noon, and Ruby was there at noon. The fellow who took the ad, according to the story Mo told me, had gone out to lunch. Accordingly, Ruby left the ad and insisted of leaving the news building, which would have been his normal procedure since there wasn't any reason for his staying there. He went over to a window in an office of the ad department, which looked out over Dealey Plaza and had a very clear view of the book depository, and he sat there and watched. Looked out the window. There wasn't anybody really to talk to, I guess, until the president's car passed, at which point he got up and left. I remember very distinctly Mo telling me this story and saying, "Why is it? What does that mean?" And why, I have never seen the story printed. I have never heard an account of it since, but it should be relatively easy to check in on. Okay, so this is driving me crazy here. This is another CIA agent providing yet another alibi. Because if you've read my book, and hopefully everybody here has gone and picked up a copy, you will know that Jack Ruby was out doing things in reference to the assassination. And Jack Ruby never went to the Dallas Morning News during that day. Jack's brother Samuel went to the Dallas Morning News. Okay, so Jack's brother, Samuel Ruby, goes into the Dallas Morning News, gets there at 10:45. He hangs out there just as Elizabeth Forsling Harris states. Giving who an alibi? Jack Ruby, right? So Jack Ruby's out there doing assassination stuff. He ends up being seen right at the time of the assassination by a guy named Vanderslice, who was out there with him on the corner of like Houston and Elm, right? So that's where Jack Ruby was. But here we have a CIA agent bringing up Jack Ruby when she didn't know Jack Ruby, had nothing to do with Jack Ruby, but yet she's providing an alibi for Jack Ruby through this person named, where the fuck was it? What was it? Mo Levy? No, it was whatever the fuck this guy's name was that she just said. And she's saying here, uncharacteristically, that Ruby was right on time. He was there. And so she's giving Jack Ruby an alibi when this was not Jack Ruby. It was Samuel Ruby while Jack Ruby was out doing all the other stuff. This is pretty interesting. Like, to me, this is just a CIA agent giving a list of CIA alibis for people. That's it. That's what this deposition's all about. All right. So when he told you the office in the story, the thing was he left before the shooting rang out. The story was told that he left, quote, when Kennedy's car passed the book depository, meaning that when he was shot without saying anything to anybody because you could not hear it that far across, he then turned and left. Somebody heard the story afterwards and told it to Mo. And I have often wondered since then what it meant and why it was it's never been checked out, if indeed it's true. And I have no reason to doubt Levy. So yeah, she's talking about Maurice Levy. We have a practice on the committee, whereas after we have taken the deposition of a witness, if the witness then wishes to give a fuller explanation of something that we have discussed or make a statement that this may not concern what we have discussed, we will allow 5 minutes or so to do that. Do you want to take a moment to think about it? Go ahead. I don't know. I have no theory on the cause of the Kennedy assassination. I am not one of those who has worked out as I have just told you. I recounted my participation in this. I have often wondered about a lot of things. I wondered why the commission was not more thorough investigation, why there was not more thorough investigation. I've always felt that the shock that I saw registered on the faces of the Johnsons and the people who were most prominent aside from the Kennedys was one that would be most genuine and horrified response. I have always been satisfied that under normal conditions for a presidential trip, and this was not the first one which I had worked, and I was familiar that all due precautions were taken, and I go back to what I said about the effort to apprehend all of the known conservative troublemakers, I should say, of any political strife, but particularly conservative. But the only thing I can say is that, in thinking about it, is that I thought about it many, many, many times. I've realized that the opportunity for some kind of plan to have been in operation was there, and none of us who were immediately concerned with it would have had any reason whatsoever, any indication that this was being done. That what I am saying is all of the people who did the work, particularly the security people who did it, their thorough job, their plan, they did it according to, ironically, knowing they would have done their jobs well, to plan to assassinate the president if they wanted to, by counting on the fact that the people who were doing the jobs they were supposed to. And beyond that, I do subscribe to the theory that the political atmosphere in Dallas was such that it would prove a comforting and encouraging atmosphere for the likes of a man like Lee Harvey Oswald. But as I say, I can see very clearly where it would have been possible to involve him and others in the conspiracy, but where none of us who were working very closely on the details of the trip would ever have any indication that such was going on. Okay, so let me just cut through the red tape on that fucking paragraph. What is she saying here? I interpret this to state that what she is saying is that while all the people who were working on the president's trip were up and above board, doing the right thing, there may very well possibly have been some members involved in this planning that were nefarious at best. Let me just say that. That was what I believe she's saying here. So, but that's what, see, here's the thing. Like, any good fucking CIA agent who's gotten any kind of anti-interrogation training is going to learn to give you answers that give you both sides of the question. Hey, do you know who anybody who could have wanted to kill the president? No, I have no idea. Other than this guy who blah, 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 blah. Maybe he's, but no, I really don't know. Right? So, like, they give you no, and then yes, and then no, and expect you to figure it out. Like, this is clear anti-interrogation training. When you get people to play both sides of the fucking question. I've not got a firm explanation as to what was happening with the Communist Party in Texas. And the reaction of the people, of the Texas people and the politicians toward what had happened with the Bay of Pigs and what had happened with the missile crisis and the allegations that Kennedy was turning the country over to communists. And I would like to hear about that. First of all, you have to understand the context to which I am going to replay your question. I am now 56 years old. And I have lived through this. World War II, the whole Cold War era, which we were very much in 63, actually. The Rosenberg's trial, the fear of communism in this country. I had moved to Texas in 1953, coming from New York. I had grown up as a liberal Democrat. I was aware that the Communist Party was a very small party. Communism was a very busy word for anything that didn't agree with the American way. I was egotistical enough to regard myself as a sophisticate in political matters. Therefore, when I moved to Texas, which was an ultra-conservative town, I was amused at the really important rampant fear of communism. Communism being this ogre, this thing on the part of otherwise very successful and presumably well-educated people. And I almost immediately became allied with the liberal Democrats in Texas. And if you were a liberal, you were also likely to be a pinko. What's a pinko? That's the euphemism for communist or somebody leaning towards communism. The fear of communism was that evident in a very busy, growing city called Dallas, Texas, was, when I first got down there, I thought was very kind of humorous, the city. In 1955, I had been asked to take the then chairman of the Democrat National Committee, a man called Paul Butler, on an 11-city tour through Texas, and the governor of the state, at the time, the Democrat governor of the state, would not shake hands with the chairman of the Democrat National Committee because he was a pinko. Governor Shivers? Yes, Alan Shivers. Johnson and Rayburn were the two political leaders in Texas, and Rayburn took liberal, and Johnson played it cool and didn't get involved in state affairs, and had very little, if anything, to do with Paul's trip through there. All of this and the liberals were a very distinctly political group, which I mentioned earlier, were distinctly in the minority in Texas, and we were often accused of having communist leanings. I was not now and never have been, and neither were those people, but if you believe in what we call today sort of common social justice, you were very suspect, and my whole attitude was always a humorous one, mixed with certain flashes of anger, but they were picking on me. But Dallas was known as the conservative leadership in Texas, and was the center of conservative leadership. It was a beautiful town, and people were very busy making money and thriving, so that and the liberal element in Texas and in Dallas went through the same tortures in every election until Ralph Yarborough finally got elected as senator. We haven't had anybody whom we could point to as a liberal person, and Yarborough himself is frequently tarred with the communist brush, so that it would not be unkind to Dallas to say that they were the great majority, that they saw a communist under every bed. I mean, anything you did that was not states' rights, ultra-conservative, that involved itself with any minorities, you didn't call them minorities. In those days, unfortunately, it was communist or pinko, which was so that whether or not this was one of the reasons I had stuck my neck out as a liberal and had done a lot of political work. So this is the main reason when I came back to Texas, I decided I was going to swallow my political interest and not become involved because I knew Dallas and you didn't get ahead in the business world. You didn't make money. You didn't succeed if you were a liberal. It was just not the way to live happily or prosperously in Texas. This gets into why this was such a big political to-do. Kennedy was regarded as a pinko or a communist, but anybody who had any interest in what might be called social equity would be called by the government serving the needs of all people, etc., was ipso facto a commie. Kennedy had been, as I said, had carried Texas, not Dallas, by the slenderest of margins. Not because there were that many people that thought that he was not a liberal, etc., but because of the famous Bruce Alger spitting incident in the 60s. Anyhow, and Johnson went from there. Through the 3 or 4 days remaining of the campaign, he talked about it, it's terrible. A man can't walk with his lady across the street without being spat upon. And this angered the people, and the scales were tipped slightly. It angered people in Texas that there were people that would do that. And thus, Kennedy barely carried the state and barely carried having anything to do with Illinois. By the time I went back to Texas, I decided I was going to get out of this business altogether, to get along with my conservative friends. And then when I got catapulted into working on this trip, particularly to represent the liberals who had no representation in the city at all on this little group that was running the Kennedy affair, I was reminded all over again that A, I was an outsider, I was a female, and people kind of liked me, but that Kennedy was, in spite of the stand that he had taken on the Bay of Pigs and the fact that he had stood off the presumed invasion of the Russians into Cuba, etc., I do not think it would be fair to say that earned him a complete turnaround position in Texas. The general average Texan that I knew, or certainly Dallasites, felt very strongly that he was a pinko president. This is why it was so terribly important to the Democrats that came to Texas and to make a good showing, to prove 2 years after his inauguration, not quite 2 years, no, it was a little over 2 years, let's see, it was 61, how many months, 1,000 days after his inauguration, that he had not lost political support, but they had actually gained it. And this was real substance of the fight, because the conservatives, most of whom are really Republicans, the Republican Party didn't amount to a tinker's dam, and they really referred to the Republican way of life, and this is why it was such a bitter contest. They did not want Kennedy to come to Texas, much less to Dallas, which was the city of the conservative strength and the city with its Bible, the Dallas Morning News. And they did not want Kennedy to have a good showing in Dallas. And this is what a great deal of the fight was. And they wanted the liberals kept out of the Trade Mart. Their attitude was that if he was coming to their city, if they were the hosts, and they were to have people coming to the luncheon. So they wanted to come. Meantime, Yarborough, who was regarded by a lot of people in Texas as the emblem of communism, this word that most people didn't understand, they didn't know what they were talking about, but this was the euphemism was regarded as the enemy, and was why this trip had so much importance. And of course, Ralph misplaced himself, wouldn't ride in the car with Johnson, wanted only to be with Kennedy, etc. But of all the froth and the whole total complete lack of understanding about the threat of communism, I can remember having fights about the fluoride problem. Putting fluoride in the water. That this was a communist effort to control the minds of Americans, and you could find any kind of way out of conservative attitude you wanted to in Texas. And as a liberal, you had to love it for other reasons. But the business community in Dallas was ultimately conservative. And as I said, this is the real source of it's the real trouble that provoked the Kennedy trip. That's why we wanted him to come down there to cool things off a little bit, and also to prove that he was a popular president. It's the reason why we didn't look for communist troublemakers. If you really, once in a while, we were looking for the conservative in the city, the ultra-conservatives who maybe take a shot at the president.
How much are you selling those posters?
And it never occurred to me, I should say, but I never heard any serious discussion about it with any possibility it'd be a communist plot. Even immediately after the assassination, nobody ever said, those commies have got him. We wondered what Lee Harvey Oswald's connection was with the ultra-conservatives. That's how deep it was. Only much later, when the Cuban stuff began to come out, all the Mark Lanes and all the other people began to expostulate these theories, and it was discovered that Oswald had been in Russia. And that sort of thing, then people began to adapt to it. But immediately before and immediately after the assassination, there was never, ever, even a wild notion that it would be a so-called communist or liberal or kind of provoking that might have accounted for Kennedy's death. It had to be conservative, which is the whole problem. It's one of society's great problems in the country, the way we sort of follow whatever is the popular thing at the time. And even those of us who think we knew it all very seldom do. And because of the news, because of the Dallas news, if you hadn't ever done it, you should go back and read some of the editorials a few weeks before that, etc. It was about as right-wing a newspaper as you can get to the right. Speaking politically and angrily sometimes to the right. And you always read the Dallas Morning News, but you always wished you had another newspaper to read. And that's why everybody assumed, and that is what Dallas was trying to fight off, and what it was conservative to these whole conservative atmosphere to make it possible for Kennedy to be killed in Dallas. But as far as it would be stretching the truth a little bit, and I say to this just kind of indicate what I'm talking about, but the attitude would have been that a commie had been killed by the conservatives was the first reaction. Do you follow me? Yes. Then it was the irony of the worst order, in some respects, to discover that it was this fellow, Oswald, who had indeed been in Russia and had a Russian wife, and then ultimately he was mixed up with the Cubans. Do you think that the Des Moines Shields knew Oswald or Lee Oswald? Yes. Did you ever talk with him about that? I had at a time a fairly new ex-husband in Dallas who was a native Dallasite, and our relations, being fairly recent, of course, were not very good. He knew Des Moines Shield better than I did, and I remember hearing one does reach conclusions soon thereafter, as soon as Marina Oswald got out and came back to town, that he was entertaining both Marina Oswald and Des Moines Shield, which immediately early on, before I left Dallas to go back to Washington, indicated, I don't know that that's true, and that he had known Marina Oswald through the Des Moines Shields. But have you never really understood that directly from him? That he knew her? No. And I, other than Des Moines Shield, stood out like a sore thumb in a community like Dallas. They were, well, just literally, it would have been very hard on the one hand and very easy on the other hand for a guy to get away with stuff like that. This is what I said when I realized so often, if you are a conspirator, how easy it is to take to move within any institution when you know pretty well how people are going to react normally. Do you follow me? And you gave the example of the Secret Service. I have worked very closely. Secret Service had nothing to do with these arrangements. I never even saw the FBI. I knew that Win Lawson was talking with them, but I would like to say one other thing. But it is possible that there is some things that might fit into your investigation that I know, but I don't recognize it. If you ever see this thing and you ever see that there was some questions that you should have asked me, should I feel free to call you? Please feel free to call me. Do you understand what I'm saying? Yes, I understand. Okay, so what I get from what she's saying here is, hey, I know a little bit more than what I'm telling you here. Hint, hint, so give me a call. That's what I'm gathering. Yes, I understand. Do you know the whole story? I do not. You know how much more detail than I do. If you see what happened here, please don't hesitate to get in contact with me. Yes, I will do that. We've covered a lot of different areas, and I will read it in the context of my knowledge of information. And if there's any other question, I will feel comfortable to pick up the phone. Yes, anything else I can do to help. It was a great tragedy for all of us. Close that at 6:45. The rest is just administrative stuff. So, this is a really important document because it establishes relationships, right? That's the thing I'm going to harp on from here till the end of time. The study of the assassination is the study of relationships. And Elizabeth Forsling Harris gave us a whole slew of new names that we can add into the mix, right? So that's going to do it for today. I hope that you guys have enjoyed this episode. Sorry it's been so long since my previous episodes, but today's Friday. I'll be back on Monday with another episode. We're going to start moving into some more obscure stuff with the assassination, or maybe some Clay Shaw, maybe some George Des Moines Shield. Definitely some stuff that you guys don't know about, for sure. But if you haven't bought my book yet, please go to Amazon.com, buy a copy. If you're going to buy the ebook, you can do that from buymeacoffee.com/JFKbook. There you can also buy my notes, right? My notes are available for $50. We've also got some limited edition posters and whatnot. But that's going to do it for me today. Hopefully you've enjoyed this episode. Please buy the book and make sure to tune in on Monday. Thanks, everybody.